You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Hello everybody and welcome to episode 20 of Social Europe podcast. My name is Henning Meyer, editor-in-chief of Social Europe. Today I'm joined by Branko Milanovic, formerly of the World Bank and today at City University of New York's Graduate Center. We talk about global inequality and the challenges it poses. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, Branko Milanovic, thank you very much for joining me today on the topic of global inequality. And just to get us going, my first question to you would be, what is your diagnosis of global inequality as it stands, and where do we stand in historical terms?
Yes, actually, let me start maybe with the historical terms first, actually. Where we stand now is that since around 2000, global inequality has declined probably, and I have to say probably because obviously our data are very shaky when it goes to the past, but probably for the first time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Because since like 1850s that we can have some guesstimates, global inequality has been rising, essentially driven by the success of the currently advanced and rich countries that actually became much richer than the rest of the world and then increased the gaps between themselves and the rest of the world and, of course, increased global inequality. Then it really sort of peaked, although it was a long plateau to the extent that we can really judge it, from probably 1970s to probably 1990s or even 2000. And then there was a decline in the last 15 years. And that decline is driven by, to some extent, a reversal of the process that I mentioned before. Nowadays, it is really the catching up of Asia, especially of China, and more recently of India, with the rich world. So that's how basically I think one can in a nutshell, describe the movement of global inequality over the last 2 centuries.
Okay, and what are the major issues today as we stand? What would you say this is the most pressing?
So for the first of all, actually the level of global inequality is extremely high. So that's one thing that one has to keep in mind, because when we say that the global inequality is most likely now on the decline, it does sound it's something very good. And indeed, it is much better that it is on the decline than if it were the reverse. However, one should not forget that really more important is the extremely high level of global inequality which still exists. Now, that high level is obviously higher than the level of even most unequal countries like South Africa or Brazil or Colombia. And the most pressing issue is, I would say, is really what the composition of global inequality, which is actually driven still by the large gaps between mean incomes between the countries. Now, why it is important? I think it's important for 2 reasons. One of them, because they lead to what I called actually the globalization, the citizenship trend, which means that people, of course, who are born in rich countries have much higher incomes, which to some extent, globally speaking, implies global inequality of opportunity. And the second thing that this particular structure of global inequality is conducive to migration. So in that sense, migration can be seen as movement of people within specific conditions of globalization, but such globalization where most of inequality is due to differences in country incomes.
And where do you see the tension between inequality within countries and inequality between countries?
That's actually quite an interesting question, because we actually more or less had a situation, and still have a situation now, that inequalities within countries are rising, whereas inequalities between countries are going down. Now, since the second element of inequalities between countries is more important in terms of overall impact, in other words, it is more important that China, from the global perspective, that China should grow fast or India should grow fast, then what happens to within national inequalities within China and India? In that sense, the fact that we do have a convergence, some convergence of incomes is a very good news. On the other hand, the fact that we continue to have increases, although they are actually much more modest recently, but there are still some increases within national inequalities, means that the gain that we would have obtained from the reduction of between national inequalities is less, simply because, technically speaking, if you have increased the within national inequalities, they sort of detract a little bit from the sort of gain that you get from between, or actually countries becoming more similar.
Okay, and what would you say are the main drivers of inequality? Are they the same in different places across the world? Are there significant differences? What would you say are the driving forces behind this?
Well, that's, of course, a very complex question because, first of all, if you look at within national inequalities, I think we do have a pretty good picture of what are the main drivers historically. I think historically the main drivers of within national inequalities, there are many. There are actually sort of what I call benign forces and malign forces. Among the benign forces were, well, of course, mass education, then technological change, globalization, social transfers, economic policies, in particular taxation and redistribution. Then among the malign forces were, of course, war, and actually before, in the pre-modern times, it was epidemics as well. So this is a very, very sort of broad, obviously, but if we want to go more recently in the last 20 years, and if you look at the rich countries, we know that essentially increasing inequality within nations was driven by technological change, by globalization, and I think the two of them, while conceptually different, are very difficult or impossible to disentangle in terms of the effects, because I think that some of the technological change was made possible. In other words, it was embodied in things which were produced by cheaper labor, which was possible through globalization. And finally, economic policies that also changed in the last 20 years.
And if we link this discussion with some of the other topics that we've dealt with on Social Europe, especially how new technologies might change the shape of the economy and labor markets in particular going forward, how do you see this playing out? If some of the sort of promises or predictions of the digital revolution come about, would that be a force for further exacerbating inequalities?
You know, that's, of course, difficult to say because, the gamut of opinion ranges from very pessimistic, where actually, the robots replace all the labor, people actually have no jobs, and it increases inequality. And I will come to the reason why it might increase inequality, to very sort of optimistic ones where essentially we live in a sort of cornucopia where we don't need to work or work very little or much less than we are working today. So I think that one of the potential dangers, although I'm actually rather on the optimistic side, I don't think that we should really fear technological change as such, because had we feared that in the past, then probably we would not have, certainly we would not have developed and we would not be where we are today. But let me say one thing which kind of could be positive, could be possibly negative, or might lead to increase in inequality. It is that if there is an increase in returns to capital, and generally there is an increase in capital intensity of production, the very fact that ownership from capital is extremely concentrated means that would actually give an extra push to inequality within nations. Just to make it very clear, if, for example, ownership of capital were more or less equal, or let's suppose ownership of capital of financial assets and all the assets, including housing and so on, were and shares obviously in the companies, if the ownership were, let's suppose, fairly equal or less unequal than even returns from labor, then increasing the capital share is not a problem because it actually reduces inequality. But the fact is that historically ownership from capital was very concentrated. So when you have an increasing importance of that particular type of income, that pushes inequality up.
So basically, this is a discussion we've had with people like Richard Freeman, who proposes the workers' share, and we had discussions about special purpose vehicles, for instance, such as sovereign wealth funds. That basically capital ownership in this context should be basically rethought, because that concentration that we have at the moment is bound to make problems worse.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I actually think that all the attempts, like for example, what Richard Freeman was mentioning, with including employee stock ownership plans, or the ideas that were floated in the 1980s with in Sweden, for example, with stock ownership by trade unions and so on. And of course more recently by Tony Atkinson in his book about what to do with inequality, and which goes back again to James Mead in the 1970s of shareholders society. I think actually attempts to reduce the concentration of capital are extremely important. So I believe they're important for two reasons. The first one that we already kind of discussed, what might happen with greater capital intensity of production and rising capital share. But secondly, because I believe that our conventional, or maybe to some extent traditional, methods of reducing inequality through taxation and transfers, I think have reached its own limit. In other words, it seems to me today that among the electorate, there is not much taste to increase taxes on the middle class. There may be some acceptance of really very high tax rates on the rich, although even on that I'm not quite sure. But certainly I think we have reached the limit there. So if you want to have lower inequality, then really a way to do that is to actually make market income, which means concentration of income from capital much more equal.
So exactly, I mean, we have to intervene in the political economy in a way that the primary distribution doesn't leave too much to be done via the secondary distribution via the tax system.
Yes, actually, I think it's absolutely crucial, and I believe this is what, in some sense, I think actually that will be the 21st century solution for not allowing inequality to get out of bounds. And it's really working on the primary distribution of endowments. It's essentially, obviously, capital endowments, but also human capital, not only in the number of years of education that people went to school, but also in the returns that they get from that schooling. And these returns, especially in the United States, but in UK also, are very uneven possibly because of the differences in quality of schools, and then there are different returns that people get from private schools versus public and so on. So I think working on this pre-distribution stage, in my opinion, is really crucial.
And this discussion already gets us to the broader point. I mean, this is some of the mechanisms that should be used in order to not allow inequality to grow too big. But what else do you think should be done in terms of general political reforms to reform globalization and make it more conducive to a more even development and less inequality?
Yeah, this is maybe the second part of the argument, and of course I'm not as familiar with that part or at least I don't have opinions on that part, which are as maybe clear, I hope, as on the first part. And it's probably more difficult because there you're really facing problems of the way that the globalization or the whole architecture that we have built in the last 60 years has been constructed. So undoing certain features of that it's very difficult. And I'm not even sure, for example, if all these trade agreements, which now seem to be basically dead in the water, whether bringing them back would be actually helpful or not. So I think there it is really much more difficult, and it's also difficult because anything that you would like to do in that area would require coordination between different governments. Even the United States alone would not be able to do it. OECD governments together probably could do something, but it really requires level of coordination that is kind of hard to imagine today. But let me just put it to be more specific. For example, coordination of the issues of tax evasion is quite, I think, feasible and possible because it affects all the governments that basically lose tax revenues. Of course, there are some countries that benefit from that, but they're relatively small and they're not that important that would be able to stop that. So there are some areas where actually I think this coordination may be forthcoming. But there are other areas, for example, intellectual property rights, which seems, and for example, the rights for pharmaceutical producers and so on, where there are obvious differences in interest between the countries.
And when we talk about trade agreements, it probably depends on what kind of content you write into them. I mean, it's not beyond belief that there could be trade agreements that actually enshrine higher social standards, higher environmental standards, and so on and so forth. Whereas what we seem to see is the attempt to enshrine the supremacy of private interests over public interests, for instance, via investor protections and these sort of things. So maybe
that's true, actually.
Yeah, maybe therefore it's unsurprising that there is resistance.
Absolutely, because of course when we say trade agreements, it actually doesn't say very much. It just says that there is a trade agreement, but it doesn't tell us at all what is inside of that trade agreement. And of course the argument has been made, and of course it's also very difficult to judge about the validity of this argument, since many of these negotiations and the deals are actually secret. So you basically have to learn from leaks and whatever is going on during the negotiation process. But certainly there could be very sort of progressive things that could be enshrined in the trade agreements. One possibility, as you mentioned, is actually much greater protection of workers' rights, but they're also currently, the way that they have apparently been done, is rather the reverse.
Exactly. Not even the basic ILO standards are apparently enshrined in these sort of agreements, let alone more. And obviously the fact that most of it is negotiated in secret and behind closed doors that is not really a trust-building exercise. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I think that's actually the least that one could say. I was actually once present when a fairly sort of important, actually, would you say, a Nobel Prize-winning economist actually said that he had to rely on the details from what he hears from people who were there, and they leak the details of the trade agreements, and that's absolutely really quite, unacceptable that you would actually have it totally behind closed doors.
Well, I mean, beyond the things that should change in terms of how you manage globalization, I think we cannot finish the conversation without sort of referring to what has recently happened with the election of Donald Trump in the United States. Is it now more likely that globalization has been thrown into reverse mode rather than reform mode?
Okay, so let me, on the first on globalization, I would also like to say that in principle, I think globalization is absolutely a very good thing, and it's actually a force for the good. And we have seen that in the effects of globalization around the world, including even in the rich countries, although because of the way that it was managed and because of the way that the domestic or national policies have been going, it has left significant chunks of the people dissatisfied or unhappy or discontent and so on. And so that brings us, of course, to the Brexit and to the election of Donald Trump, which clearly shows that the numbers of people who have been left out are significant, and they have eventually sort of realized that they have found a champion that they believe is going to help them. Now, whether that champion is going to help them is I think it's a big question. I actually don't believe that he or anybody similar like him, like Marine Le Pen in France tomorrow, might be able to do much. And I definitely see globalization as we have seen it in the last 30 years, coming not necessarily to a halt, but coming to a different stage. I don't think that there will be significant reversals. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I don't see the significant reversals simply because of the difficulty of implementing that and of the huge cost that it would have on different parts of the population. And I think Brexit is a very good example of that, because once you start trying to go into sort of the implementation of Brexit within the UK and even further when one day it has to be implemented, and it's a big question whether it will be implemented with the EU, then you really discover thousands of problems. So I believe, likewise with Trump, when he would try to do certain things, I think he would just discover the many problems, and many people around him, or people who have been his supporters, losing out. So I don't think that there will be really an ability to reverse. But on the other hand, I don't think that we are going to continue on the same path of sort of greater and greater globalization and integration of markets that we have had in the last 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, the electorate in the UK and in the US have delivered a situation that even Trump or the people in charge here simply cannot resolve, because you could see that particularly in the UK, where there are so many internal contradictions in what apparently the mission is, that it's impossible to resolve this question. But
I believe so, yeah. And also with Trump, it's even more, I think, obvious because there are different parts of his program, if one can even say that there is a program. But there are different parts that are clearly incompatible, and there are parts, as I said before, that actually, if he were to try to implement them, would be sort of perceived very negatively or unfavorably by groups who voted for him. So that would really make it very difficult for him to go further down that path. So that's why I'm a little bit optimistic.
Yeah, but there seems to be, nevertheless, little doubt that there has to be a transformation of globalization as we've seen it. Because, I mean, as far as I can see, we've had socioeconomic grievances as a result of globalization that translated more and more as time went on into distrust in the political system to affect positive change for people, up to the point where now everybody who's seen as an outsider has a realistic shout because people feel disenfranchised and not being able to affect positive change for their lives.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that because absolutely, I think so. It's what has happened is this trust in the political system, and especially to a large extent to the political system, and absolutely clearly distrust towards the establishment, insiders, elites, however you want to call them. And I think to a large extent, I do blame the elites for that because well understood self-interest from their side, would have dictated them to realize that there was discontent, and there are some measures that should be taken or should have been taken to actually, if I'm not saying solve, but actually to make the problems less obvious or less sort of sharp for a significant percentage of the population. And now, of course, these problems will be dealt with by those who came to power actually on a very populist platform. And maybe they would not be able to do anything, but certainly this would be done, the solution, quote unquote, would be done by the outsiders, which I think was really a mistake. And I think actually probably people from the establishment now realize that it was a mistake. It's not easily, of course, done, and it would have required at least one presidential mandate to do something more seriously. But I think it is just that they underestimated the extent and the depth of dissatisfaction which existed.
Yeah, I mean, there is a general tendency apparently built in, especially in political systems that are based on two-party competition, that you underestimate what is really going on underneath the surface until there is basically a violent swing that expresses itself in the election results, not in the actual number of votes, because, the shift there has been maybe not more than previously. But if you look at elections in the UK and the United States, it's just basically the final drop that makes a difference, and then leads to quite violent political swing.
Right, but of course that is the feature of the systems that are where the winner takes all. And it is also, to be quite honest, one has to be said that particular system oftentimes benefited the other side. So, and there is not much of a swing of the vote because it really requires a relatively few votes, and in the U.S. case even more kind of spectacularly. It requires really specific votes in specific states to affect that shift, even if the overall number of votes, as we see now, actually is very different. So that actually Hillary obviously got more votes than Trump. But it is also true that actually that particular logic also very often benefited the incumbents, or as you know, of course, in the UK system, the ability of, for example, UK Independence Party to have seats in Congress was very limited and was totally disproportionate to its influence in terms of votes. But one thing which I think is also very sort of concerning is that what happened with Brexit and with Trump then would have a further effect on the rest of West European countries, in particular, for example, Italy or France, and possibly even in Germany. And we see that sort of dynamic playing out very sort of badly to some extent because Brexit certainly, I think, helped Trump in the U.S. And now what happened in the U.S. has global sort of consequences, and it might actually help similar parties in Western Europe. I meant in particular France, Italy, Germany, but certainly also in the Netherlands, possibly in Sweden and elsewhere.
Well, I mean, we've been dealt at least 2 wake-up calls now, and we'll see whether this is the end or just the beginning. Thank you, Branko Milanovic, for taking the time to talk to me today. And I'm sure this will be very interesting to watch in 2017.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure. And I hope that by the end of the next year, we have a little bit better news then.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.